Hello and welcome to another video from Fantasy Football Scout. My name is David and today we are going to be looking at some of the worst FPL assets this season, which I appreciate is a little bit of a step change because normally when you come and watch one of our videos or listen to one of our podcasts, you would be expecting that we would perhaps be talking about players you should sign for your team. And obviously we want to be getting the best ones. Well, now that the season's finished, the Gameweek 38 deadline is passed, the Gameweek 38 matches are passed, and there's just absolutely no more decisions left for you to make. It's time for us to be able to unleash hellfire and fury on some of these assets that have caused us great frustration this season and have a look at what went wrong for some of these players. But at the same time, there's going to be some green shoots of hope potentially as well, because these are players who underperformed this season, probably largely because of price. So we're sort of expecting some of these guys to cost a little bit less next season, which might mean that with a few tweaks here and there, they could be budget assets. Well, we'll see. Some assets that can offer some value for next season. That's what we could potentially unearth here, whilst also really zoning in on some of the most painful experiences of the season. Those of you watching on YouTube will be able to see, of course, so we've got a nice picture of Pep Guardiola looking rather frustrated with his number one goalkeeper, Ederson, there. That is something that a lot of fantasy managers found themselves doing this season. And it is with the goalkeepers that we begin. And we can't really start anywhere else. When we talk about the worst goalkeepers this season, and from a fantasy perspective, we should say, he's not had a bad season as an individual, but as a fantasy asset, it's not been his finest season, or really for expensive goalkeepers in general. And Ederson, is absolutely the poster boy for expensive goalkeepers really just not being worth the money anymore. The thing about expensive goalkeepers in FPL, as we all know, is you're usually going in there for lots of clean sheets and not very many saves. That's the general dynamic that we've grown accustomed to, because the teams, they keep lots of clean sheets, usually have a very good defence in front of them. They don't allow too many shots. It means we don't get too many saves. And it's always been a bit of a struggle, this particular category of players, because do you pay that extra money for the higher chance of clean sheets but a lower chance of saves, or do you go someone cheaper who's slightly less likely to keep the clean sheets but could make up the gap with the saves and the bonus? Historically, we've favoured the cheaper ones, but Ederson in the past has been a nice 6 million, 5.5 million, something like that, 20 clean sheets a season. Well, just 11 for him in the 2022-23 season, which is just so far below what we're used to with him. And he was actually joint 15th among first choice goalkeepers for points per match this season as well. So really not getting your money's worth here at all. And we discussed it quite a lot in a couple of the videos that I've done on Sundays this season, because City play a lot of their games on Sundays for sort of television reasons. It was very, very normal for me to just be inundated with people just once again frustrated with Ederson in a team that's actually quite good defensively. That's the strange thing here with Man City. They have always been a team that don't concede too many chances because they, of course, defend via possession. They don't give up lots of shots, not because they can defend well in the traditional sense. They're just very, very good at holding onto the ball, and then teams can't have shots because they just don't have the ball, which sounds obvious, but that's just how City do it. And the problem is that they aren't actually that good defensively in the traditional sense. My opinion is if you had to put the Man City 11 just in their own defensive third for an entire 90-minute training match, attack versus defence, I think they would probably lose 3 or 4-0 because they're just not built that way. And so whenever chances did pop up, they quite often ended up in the back of the net. And that just continued to hamper Ederson throughout the whole season, even though his stock as a fantasy asset was quite high for a long time, because you look at the stats for City and they had decent numbers, as we said before, perhaps a bit of an anomaly when it comes to those decent numbers compared to everybody else. But then he became really, really popular when we had the double game weeks, because Pep Roulette is always an issue when it comes to double game weeks. Who is going to play twice? You probably want a City defender if they're going to play twice. But Ederson was always the most likely player out of the defensive assets to play twice. So whether that's John Stones or Ake or Cancelo once upon a time, back as far as I think it was, I think technically it was February that he left, but it was a January move, wasn't it? But so Ederson was chosen a lot. And we've got on the screen here his double game week contributions for the season. This is actually a screenshot that's taken from a Scout article before the final match of double game week 37. But yeah, double game week 20, 2 points for Ederson. Double game week 23, 3 points for Ederson. Double game week 34, 1 point for Ederson. No points in the first of his double game week 37 match, as you can see on the screen as well. So it's just, you pay the extra money for this guy. You really need to be getting the investment in the double game weeks, and it just didn't happen at all. And yeah, very unfortunate. But as we said, with some of these guys, they're guys that had a bad season. You would like to expect that maybe could hinder their prices for next season. And so, yeah, there's possibly a question here over whether or not FPL maybe have some big decisions to make about Man City defenders, especially Ederson, because he'd been 6 million for a while, and then I think that dynamic we just talked about a few seconds ago about the more expensive goalkeepers they tend to just get you clean sheets and not much else, and then some 4.5 million or a 5 million goalkeeper, 2 or 3 of those tend to usually eclipse them for points overall. Had, I think, forced their hand because De Gea and Ederson, I think, were both 5.5 at the start of this season. Now, are we going to see Ederson drop down to 5 million? It would feel wrong for that to happen because City are still, obviously, the best team in the league because they just won it. And they do always have a good defence in terms of they don't give up many chances. So I think he's probably going to stay at 5.5. But if you came down to 5 million, I wouldn't be enormously shocked. And if that happens, then all of a sudden he's a little bit more potentially worthy of an investment. Perhaps. Let us know what you think in the comments. What price do you think Ederson should be next season? And before we continue, we've got some other players to go through. I just want to give a shout out to Neil, or Sconto Rigger, as you might know him on site. The most disappointing FPL team of 2022-23 article is where I've taken a lot of this information from. And so if you would like to go and have a read of that with some even more great analysis of the numbers, then head there. And we also have to give a big shout out to UR Cantonar's Hot Topic on the site, which inspired the article, which inspired the video. So I just want to make sure I give a shout out to you guys. Thank you very much for your contribution to this rather informal look at some really frustrating guys this season. Now, we couldn't talk about frustrating goalkeepers without talking about our honourable mention section. Danny Ward and Daniel Everson, the two Dannys. I mean, wow. What a season we had with them. Well, half a season, I suppose. It's not very often that you end up with a situation where you can have 2 4 million goalkeepers that play for the same team and you know one of them is going to start. And that meant that this combination was enormously popular at the start of the season. And on paper it should have worked. And there was a brief spell where it did work. But the reason why, these guys are absolutely in the flops or the most disappointing team of the season, however you want to describe it, is because it only started working once people started to move away from it. So Leicester's clean sheet against Newcastle in game week 37 was their first clean sheet since, I think, game week 16. It was a very long time they went without a clean sheet. They just had an awful season defensively, and that's why they've been relegated. They had 6 clean sheets between game weeks 9 and 16 and had none between game weeks 1 to 8. And so in those 8 game weeks, we had the Ward and the Everson combination, and most people were so frustrated with it that they wildcarded around game week 7 or 8 and got rid of either both of them or just kept Ward because he was the one who was clearly the first choice of the two, and then switched to maybe Nick Pope or one of the other goalkeepers. And so Ward then became their substitute because he was a 3.94 million goalkeeper. And then that's when they started keeping clean sheets. I was actually very fortunate because I held on to them both on my wildcard, because I think I wildcarded maybe game week 9 or something, and there had been mild defensive improvements, so I got a little bit lucky there. But yes, for the most part, they trolled people very, very heavily. And what I've also got on the screen, actually, is one of my other favourite stats for goalkeepers, is XG prevented. So we're getting into some real nerdy levels of analysis here. And this is an extract from the Fantasy Football Scout members area. If you're not already a member, make sure you consider that for the new season. It will make a big, big difference on your overall rank at the end of the season. I can promise you that. But yeah, XG prevented, what does it mean? So it is the score of the shots that a goalkeeper faces versus how many goals they actually conceded. And so it's effectively telling you who had a bad season as a goalkeeper. If you've got an XG prevented that is very low, so it's a very big negative figure, then it means that you conceded way more goals than you should have done as a goalkeeper. And if you've got a very big positive number, so like a plus, 6.7, that's you've faced a lot of high XG shots and you've managed to still save them because you're a good goalkeeper. So historically, Nick Pope's done well on this metric. Dean Henderson did a couple of years ago as well, and that's quite useful. This is a nice little tip here for next season. If you're trying to identify a budget goalkeeper who is likely to be in a team that gives up lots of shots but still keeps some clean sheets and gets lots of bonus, because the goalkeepers that can make fantastic saves and stop certain goals in teams that concede lots of shots, that can be the difference that turns them into clean sheets and bonus. And so Nick Pope, as I said, has done well in this past when he was playing at Burnley. That's the perfect team to aim for. So if you're ever, sometime into the start of next season, 4 or 5 game weeks in, looking for that goalkeeper who can help you capitalise, use this particular table in the members area. But what it illustrates for this season is just some of the really awful goalkeepers that we had. So Danny Ward is the 3rd worst goalkeeper in terms of individual performance, according to XG Prevented, about -9 goals more than he should have. Conceded 9 more goals than he should have done. But the reason I bring this up is because the absolute worst was Gavin Bazunu, who I don't really think any of you ever had at any point, but I don't think I've ever seen a stat like this. He managed to concede over 20 more goals than Opta deemed he should have done based on the quality of shots he faced. And that is absolutely why Southampton got relegated. But yeah, that's a little nerdy moment there for me to enjoy from one of my favourite underappreciated stats, XG Prevented. You heard it here first. So, who else can we talk about? We're going to move into defence now, and we just can't talk about flop defenders this season without talking about Ivan Perisic. Oh, another very, very frustrating asset this season who didn't actually do that badly, but it's just a bit like the Ward-Everson combination. It only did well when you weren't invested, and when you were, it didn't, because he just became unbelievably unpredictable. And so he only actually ended up with 2.8 points per match this season. But when he did play, he did well, but you just didn't know when he was going to start or when he was going to come on. So he had 11 substitute appearances, I think it was, in total this season. And so out of all defenders, only 5 featured more as a sub than him. And so he was never able to actually capitalise on clean sheets when they actually happened, which admittedly was rare for Spurs. And then when he was on the pitch, he was useful, of course, but sometimes he didn't start either. And actually, in the end, Ryan Mason didn't really play him in a position that was going to really help him. So he wasn't really an option in the second half of the season. He was very much an exciting one at the start of the season. He had some great numbers, but you just never know. You just never knew when they were going to be coming. So, yeah, very, very frustrating. And a very similar asset in that regard. Probably these two. So Reece James and Ben Chilwell. Now, interestingly here on Reece James, that he had one of the worst points per start average of any FPL defender priced above 5 million. So that's largely what we're describing as we're verging into what is a premium asset. I mean, premium is probably 5.5, but in that general bracket of spending more than your usual 4.5, just 3 points per start. And so clearly it's not just about the unpredictability of when he was going to play, because we had a bit of Tuchel rotation at the start of the season, of course. It was the fact that when he was on the pitch, it wasn't necessarily always doing the business. And to be fair, it hasn't exactly been a very good season for Chelsea, as we all know. I don't really need to go into the specifics of why on that one. You all know, very aware of how bad that Chelsea season was that we've just had. But what the impact was on Reece James was that he wasn't always playing in a wing-back role, which is, of course, where he is always better utilised. And he sometimes even played as the right-hand side of a back three. So, yeah, that didn't really help him at all. And, yeah, the thing about him, I've always said this, he's very boom and bust. And I remember actually even saying this right at the start of the season. He was actually quite popular at the beginning. And I had been stung by him enough times to know that he will maybe have like an 18-point haul and then have 3 or 4 blanks in a row and then a 15-point haul. Well, his season was boom and bust in the sense that it boomed and then it busted and then it stayed busted because half of his season total arrived in the first 4 game weeks. And 10 of his 14 starts resulted in blanks. Injury, of course, has been a factor here as well, which hasn't been nice. I mean, the thing is, he is a fantastic player. If you've ever had the chance to watch this guy live, he's incredible. He's capable of playing in midfield as well. Did that very capably in the Football League as well. So he is a fantastic player. Has he been very frustrating as a fantasy asset? Continually so for a long time. He absolutely has. So unfortunately, he does make this list. Now, this one pains me to put in because I'm a big fan of Andrew Robertson, and I've always been a fan of attacking fullbacks in FPL. I mean, I think we all have really, but Robertson, I mean, he had some golden years as a must-own, and it's easy to forget sometimes because Robertson and Trent have become a bit of an iconic duo in fantasy football over the sort of past 4 or 5 years. But Robertson kind of broke onto the scene before Trent did. I remember having him several months before we'd even heard of him. Before Joe's famous line on the Scoutcast where he just assumed, I think, that Trent Alexander-Arnold just sounded like some random fake name regen guy from Football Manager. Who's this guy? And then, of course, Trent ended up eclipsing him. But for long periods, Andrew Robertson has been FPL royalty. But unfortunately, this season, it wasn't meant to be, really. And it's been a while since we've been able to really justify spending money on him. He started at 7 million, which probably was fair based on what we knew of Liverpool at the start of the season. But as we know, as the season wound on, that clearly was a price that we weren't, able to pay. Some big names, or rather not so big names, not household names, shall we say, ahead of him for points per match this season include Ben Mee, Tyrone Mings. So, value was never really helpful here. And the thing is, Liverpool's clean sheets weren't great this season. We know that anyway. But even when they did keep them, Robertson actually... This is the first season where he hasn't actually been nailed on as much. And so he kept kind of avoiding them. So Liverpool actually kept out... They kept a shutout, in 5 of the 6 games in which he was on the subs bench and therefore not able to capitalise. And Shimikas has started to actually get involved now. There was a time when Shimikas was there and Robertson just played every week, but it's been harder to predict when Robbo's going to play across the course of a season. We could have usually working out 1 week to the next, but either way, the point was he wasn't getting consistent starts. That wasn't very helpful. But the most interesting thing, and this is something to keep an eye on for next season, is what happened to him as a result of Trent Alexander-Arnold's shift into a new role. Now, it's fairly well documented at this point, so I'd like to think that if you're listening to this podcast or you're watching this as a video, then you will know very much about the fact that Trent has shifted into this central midfield role, and so Liverpool now play this kind of 3-2-2-3 lineup that pushes Trent into a position where he is less likely to risk the team's general defensive structure by going on forward runs. Because in the past, he'd played arguably a wing-back role in what was technically a 4-3-3, a back four, and would sometimes leave a massive gap at the back for people to get into. By shifting him into midfield and then shunting the back four into a back three so that there is slightly more cover for that right back area should Trent push himself a little bit more forward, has helped Liverpool improve. We can't deny that. So it has looked good. But what it hasn't happened symmetrically in terms of the fullbacks as we know them traditionally. So whilst Trent has stepped into midfield, Robertson hasn't done that. And has been hampered, you could say, by having to act as a hybrid centre-back, left-back in that system. And so what we can see on the screen right now is some touch maps for... Oh, sorry, that's the passes received. This is the touch maps. This is the touch maps of the two players between game weeks 30 and 38, which largely captures that period where Trent was playing in that more advanced role. And what you can see for the touch maps is that Trent's touches are just absolutely everywhere. He does actually still have quite a lot of touches in that right back area, but there is just an absolute swamp of heat bleeding over into the middle of the park, and even lots of touches in the penalty box. Now, what I find really interesting about this is that traditionally, Trent and Robbo, I've obviously just described them as, they're both fullbacks, but they were very asymmetrical in the way that they put balls into the box. The thing about Trent was that he would sort of take up almost a wide De Bruyne position. So he wasn't. He would cross from deep. Is what I mean to say. And, so that sort of that space between the halfway line and the edge of the box on the flank, that's where he would cross from, and the ball would sort of loop in. Robertson was very, very good at snaking all the way along the byline on the left-hand side, and then cutting into the box and making penalty box entries right as he hit the dead ball line, and then pulling it back. That was traditionally where we saw those how those two players operate. And what you can see here is that Trent's new role has allowed him to actually make more penalty box entries than Robertson, which is not something that we're very used to. And so it just means this whole system, and I'll just put on the screen the passes received as well, so you can see where those players are when they receive the ball. It's very much a similar story, but what you'll notice is that actually there's a massive gap. There's almost a huge chunk missing from Trent's heat map, whereby he isn't receiving the ball in a right back position at all, which we kind of know because we've been watching the games and we can see where he's been operating from. But Robertson very much is just pretty much isolated to left back and left wing, so he's still pushing forward. And we should say he's got a very good engine on him. He was always much better at tracking back anyway. So the system sort of is catering. It is asymmetrical in some respects because it is catering towards the fact that Robertson was very, very good at making penalty box entries down the left and then pegging it back to sort things out. Trent would cross from deep but wasn't so good at covering back. But yeah, it just has meant that Robertson hasn't been able to break into the box as much as he was before. So that has made him an even worse option. I think will be interesting this season is just seeing next season, I should say, is just seeing how big a gap we get between Trent and Robertson's price, because we could actually justify, to be honest, maybe even a 1 million a gap between the two players. So it'll be very interesting to see. But unfortunately, it does mean that Robbo is going to have to count as a flop this season. As much as it pains me to say it, I'm a big fan. I think FPL aside, just talking about football, I think he's one of the best fullbacks we've seen in recent years. I'm a big fan. But yeah, sorry, Robbo, we'll have to consign you to the flops list. Now, a couple of other honourable mentions. This one feels like a weird one to include, but I understand why we have to talk about him. Cancelo, he was just on auto include every week, and then just all of a sudden, bang, like that, he's gone. Which is very annoying. I guess he counts as a flop because he was very, very useful, and then all of a sudden just immediately disappeared in a way that felt very strange. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with him next season. And with a little bit of help from Neil's article and Uar Cantona's hot topic, we can also include, I think here, Joel Matip and Laporte, who last season were quite useful centre-back options at their respective clubs, but they very much lost their place this season after attracting a little bit of fantasy ownership at the start of the season. They're at the big clubs. The really budget options that really got talked about at the start of the season, Nathan Patterson and Neco Williams were the big 4 million defenders. And unfortunately, there was no repeat of the old, that man there behind me, John Lundstrom. We haven't had him in a while. And I think Livramento sort of got half a season of it the year before. The 4 millions this year were very much flops because... yeah, Patterson had his injuries, Everton conceded lots of goals, and Forest, wow, they conceded an absolute shed load of them. So, unfortunately, not too many 4 million options this year. Let's move into midfield now, and let's talk about a man who has a lot of fantasy pedigree, but has not had a very good season, and that is Raheem Sterling. Ended up missing out on the England squad as well in the end, his price had been steadily going down. It was his cheapest FPL starting price since 2017-18. And in the end, he basically he only just crept into having 100 points this season because he got an assist on the final day of the season, despite actually starting, or at least appearing 27 times for Chelsea, which is actually quite a lot. His points tally looks like someone who hasn't played that much, but actually he played quite a lot. And he just has kind of gone missing. But should we be too surprised? Not really. Chelsea have had a very, very bad season. And, it's not just down to him, but it just means that of what we've got on the screen right now is we've got the top 5 most expensive midfielders in the game this year, which were Salah, De Bruyne, Bruno Fernandes, Raheem Sterling, and Son Heung-min. And just 4 points per start for Sterling in the end, which is not really enough to justify his price. And 101 points is one of his lowest tallies in a very, very long time. Now, big summer coming up for Chelsea. We know that anyway. Pochettino coming in, could potentially give them enough direction to reboot, kickstart some of these players. And Sterling is someone I have my eye on, not necessarily because I want him in my squad for Game Week 1, but more along the lines of he should have a very, very big points drop. And Neil, in the article on Fantasy Football Scout, which as I said, absolutely go and read, makes a very good comparison with Marcus Rashford, who he shot up in price and then had a poor season, and this season was much cheaper. I think he started the season at 7 or 7.5, something like that. Either way, a very justifiable price. Did very, very well. Was captained a lot this season, and he's probably going to make the team of the season among midfielders, I would imagine, for FPL points. Not necessarily points, but just value. It's very subjective. Make sure you get to the website to Fantasy Football Scout to vote in that, because that is coming up. He should make that team of the season. So a lot of that's to do with price. So if Sterling comes down to that level, maybe, just maybe, next season. Now, someone else who maybe could benefit in the same regard could be Son. He has had his, I think he was 11.5 at the start of the season. I think it was 12 million, but I think he dropped to 11.5 in the end. It's his lowest points tally this season since 2015-16. And again, it's a bit like Chelsea. Spurs have had an absolutely awful campaign. So maybe with a bit of direction in the new season, and maybe with Harry Kane potentially leaving, does Son get the penalties? Maybe. But at the same time, if Harry Kane does leave, does that make Son a general worse asset in open play? Potentially. I'm not sure. But yeah, just 3.8 points per start for Son this season, which when you're paying, double figures for a guy is really not all that great. But there are some green shoots again. So talked about some of these guys already. This is what's happened to Son recently with Ryan Mason in charge. Now, is he going to be in charge next season? Probably not. But could he still be on the staff? Possibly, because this has happened before. He has interim managed this team before. So he's of a sufficient. Doesn't have sufficient stock to be a big name that they need to boot away if they bring in a full-time manager who isn't him. So that input could still be there. So I think we don't quite take this data with a pinch of salt, but we certainly we at the same time we don't treat it like gospel. Something halfway between gospel and salt, whatever the middle of that gap is. We can just about take some green shoots of hope, I think, from what happened with Ryan Mason. He was playing more advanced in the last 5-6 games of the season. And so the stat that is particularly telling is that under Conte this season, he was afforded 7 big chances in 28 appearances, but under Ryan Mason, he ended up with 6 big chances in 5 games, and that's accurate up until Sunday. I haven't had the chance to factor in Sunday's data into that particular stat, but what I have managed to factor Sunday's data into is these XG shot maps, which I've got on the screen right now, which I will describe for the podcast listeners. Now, XG shot maps are one of my favourite things from the Fantasy Football Scout members area. Already talked about XG prevented. XG shots, I'm a big fan. So, what it does is it identifies every single shot that a player has made in the period you've chosen. And so on the left-hand side, I've got Son, game weeks 1 to 32. And on the right-hand side, I've got Son, game weeks 33 to 38. And each shot is a different size because it's relative to what the XG is for that shot. So if you've had a shot that's got very low XG, it's going to be a very, very tiny bubble. And if you've got a shot that's very high XG, it's going to have a much bigger bubble. If it's on target, then it's green. If it's a goal, it's green. And if it's not a goal, it's blue. So that helps you understand where they're all coming from. And what we can see is, and it's sort of subjective here because you sort of have to describe the pattern of the bubbles. But yeah, so on the left-hand side, the Son XG shots from game weeks 1 to 32, so that's all of the Conte reign and a little bit after as well. You can see there's a massive smattering of very small circles outside the box, and then there's a bit of a smattering of small ones in the box as well, with a couple of something I would describe halfway between small and medium in the box, between the edge of the 6-yard box and the edge of the box itself. Now, the right-hand side, there is fewer shots because it is obviously a shorter period, but the key here is we've just got a higher concentration of the bigger bubbles. And, you can see that they're all much closer to goal. You can see that they're on average of a bigger size. And so, effectively, the long story short is, without the nerdy level of it all, is that towards the end of the season, Son was able to get much closer to goal. He was able to have more shots of a higher quality in that area, and hardly anything outside the box. He wasn't, just having pops from the edge of the box. In fact, I make it just 2 outside the box and 1 that's kind of on the line of the box. Whereas, a good, I would say, half of Son's shots before that point were chances from the edge of the area. So, if either the new manager has noticed that, or if Ryan Mason becomes the new manager, or if the new manager keeps Ryan Mason on the staff and he tells that manager, you know what, probably need to get Son in this area, then maybe his drop in price, which is definitely going to happen, it's probably going to be significant. Maybe Son next season, it could be time for him again. A couple of honourable mentions then. I have to start with Pedro Neto and Leon Bailey. Now, it feels like a long time since we've mentioned those guys on these streams, but do you remember in the year of our Lord 2022, in that famed summer, when Pedro Neto and Leon Bailey were both just absolutely nailed on players in everybody's teams, because I think they had pretty good pre-season. They were both 5 million, they're potentially underpriced. I ended up with both of them, and Neto especially. I mean, he's had a bad season for injuries, but I feel very bad because I tipped him for a lot of people, and he didn't do very well in the end. And Leon Bailey, I mean, wow, he dropped down to 4.3 in the end, and didn't have a very good start of the season. He actually did much better towards the end of the season. So it was 9 attacking returns, which is actually pretty good for a 5 million midfielder. But either way, at the start of the season, it just wasn't working. And of course, Steven Gerrard was the manager, and there was that one game week where he talked him up, and then he didn't start. It was very, very frustrating. Very frustrating. Anthony as well had some good stats throughout all of the season. Started fairly well, looked quite good, big for the X vibes, you could say. But yeah, his shot to goal conversion rate this season was just 5.6% and 19 blanks in 21 appearances after his first 3 starts. So yeah, he very much flatters to deceive. He needs to do some shooting practice over the summer, or we're going to be in a situation whereby he's just going to not have a very good season again. And one player I might just go back to the Son page so you can see it, because his teammate Kulishevsky hadn't done particularly well. But basically, he had a points per start average of 3.6, which was the worst of any midfielder, priced at 7.5 million and below. He came in, I think, at 6 million last season and was one of these players who did really, really well, great value. But that Huijken price and then him just having a bad season meant that he was a bit of a flop, to be honest. So we finished then with the forwards. And we can't start anywhere else than the old Darwin Nunez. Not some great stats here. So he came in at the start of the season amid much clamour for him to be in people's teams. And I want to say talked about in the same sentence, not necessarily breath, as Erling Haaland. But yes, in the end, 167 points and 27 league goals separated the two. And an excellent point in this article on Scout is that his season peaked with his doing very well in the Community Shield and then getting 9 points in game week 1. But of course, then with the red card, pretty much as I think I even remember Gianni taking a hit for like game week 2 only for him to get sent off. I mean, it really was just utter chaos. And of course, that has been his nickname. He is the chaos machine. He was always afforded a lot of shots, but he just couldn't convert them. He was not necessarily always off target. He just couldn't convert them. So his big chance conversion rate of just over 25% was the 36th best among FPL forwards. And his underachievement compared to his XG, which we can just see on the screen here, is minus 3.16. So he was in the top 10 worst strikers for not being able to put chances away. And and then eventually he just couldn't actually quite nail down a starting spot either. So he very, very quickly became a bit of a flop. But the key to why these guys are sometimes flops is because there was a lot of excitement about him, and there were people taking risks and punts on him to start with. Then he started well enough with those matches we mentioned that people were like, it's just coming, it's coming, it's coming. I'm going to hold him, I'm going to hold him, I'm going to hold him. And it just never quite materialised. Probably going to be a price drop for him. Firmino's leaving. Do you think he's going to start more? I don't know. Let us know what you think Darwin's second season is going to look like. Let us know in the comments. Unfortunately, his points per average this season was the same as Shea Adams. So, fine company there. Now, Kai Havertz, he is used to this probably. Again, he's a player that I do actually like. You have to sometimes extract your football brain from your FPL things, because I do like what he brings to a team. I think he looks good when he's on the ball, and he can finish well. Like, I have seen him do that. And it just depends what type of system you're playing. He's as a false nine, I personally quite enjoy watching him. But does that translate into FPL points? No. Has anybody recovered from Gameweek 9 last season when we all captained him and Salah went nuclear? Absolutely not. He very much suffers from the same thing that all the other Chelsea players do. So, again, we're not trying to be harsh here. They've just generally had a bad season. You never knew when he was going to start. When he did start, that team just wasn't built to put chances away, to be honest. And so, And him switching to a forward didn't help either, actually, because, of course, that's just less points across the board. And so, that really has nerfed him, unfortunately. We will have to see for next season what will happen with him. We have to talk about Jamie Vardy as well. He's also on this list, so we'll just lean into very much the XG delta to sort of round off this list for some of the honourable mentions, because the 5 worst players in the Premier League for XG delta. So that means it's a bit like XG prevented. So if you've got a negative figure for a forward, this is, if you're having shots, then it means that you scored fewer goals than you should have done based on the quality of the chances that you had. And Vardy was the 4th worst this season, minus 3.72. And the thing is, he did actually still play a fair bit this season. He didn't play as much as he did before. But it wasn't like it was hardly around, and unfortunately, it might just be that the clock has been ticking on his career, and he's just been unable to sustain the level of output that he'd done up until now. Bit of a shame, because he is a fantasy. He will always go down as a fantasy legend. He was a budget success when they won the league, and then spent a good number of years being a sort of lower premium priced, like a 9 million forward that could always shake up a template and get big hauls. But yes, unfortunately, it does look as if his time in FPL is going to be over. Leicester have been relegated. Will he get a move to a Premier League team? It's hard to say. He's very committed to Leicester. He might have felt this season that perhaps the Premier League is now a speed that's too quick for him, and might potentially fancy a year or two in the Championship just to round things off. So, unfortunately, may have to wave farewell to a bit of a fantasy legend there. But we also have to talk about Calvert-Lewin and Bamford as well, players who kind of get talked about here, to be honest, because of injury, but also a bit of just lack of accuracy in front of goal. So they actually round off the top 3. So Havertz is the 2nd worst for XG delta this season, minus 4.6 for him. But so Bamford with the worst of minus 4.61, and then Calvert-Lewin minus 3.84. So didn't put away as many chances as they should have done. Didn't play as often as they should have done because they got injured, which is of course very unfortunate. But they're 2 players who last season were very much in the conversation for your mid-price forwards. And very few of us will forget that fantastic first season that Leeds had when Bamford became a bit of an essential asset. And of course, Calvert-Lewin stayed up, so he'll be around next season, but we need to see a bit more fitness from him, and we really need to see Everton kick on and really build for the future after a bad couple of years. And Leeds relegated to the Premier League again, relegated to the Championship, I should say, again for the first time. Well, their first relegation in the Premier League actually for a long time, but they're back in the Championship after 3 Premier League seasons, and it'd be interesting to see what happens with Bamford. It'd be nice to see him get fit and maybe sign for another team. We know he's got it in him because we've seen it before, but unfortunately it wasn't meant to be this season, and probably a bit too expensive even if he had been putting his chances away. So yes, that rounds off the list of the flops for this season. But, of course, if you have had a particular player who has trolled you massively this season and has made you as angry as Pep Guardiola is in this particular picture this season, then let us know in the comments. I'd love to hear who frustrated you the most this season. Or if there's anybody on this list who you feel that it was a bit of a harsh inclusion, then let me know as well. And there's going to be plenty more content throughout the summer. We're going to be reviewing the season a little bit over the next week or two. We'll have more in-depth analysis of the players that did well. So we're going to look at goalkeepers, defenders, midfielders and forwards as we prepare to name the official team of the season according to Fantasy Football Scout writers. And we've also got Gameweek 39 coming up as well. Lots of scout involvement in that, including myself and a couple of my Team South and Team North colleagues. So if you would like to get involved in that, then just let us know in the comments or get in touch on Twitter or on site. We can give you a bit more information on that. If you go to Gameweek 39 North versus South.co.uk, you can make a donation there to Street Child United, which is a fantastic charity that helps children from difficult backgrounds. So that's something that we're looking forward to this summer as well. So hope you're enjoying your well-earned rest so far. You've only had one day of it. Make sure you make the most of your rest from decisions, but we can still have a look back on the season just gone and look forward on a few of the exciting, fun, gimmicky things to come this summer. So I will leave you fine folks to enjoy the rest of your bank holiday, and I will see you soon.